All right, well, it is 9 o'clock, so I think we are going to get started. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar this morning. For those of you, I think there might be some people that are signed up from far away. So this is an early morning for you all, and hopefully it's beneficial for you. So today we're going to talk about the state of the state, and we are going to start with the state of New York. So this will probably be a series that we will end up doing, where we're going to focus on some of the different states around the country that have had some significant decreases in enrollment over the years and were impacted by COVID. We're going to take a look at how those states stand. We're going to take a look at some of the competitors, and we might be starting to put out some different studies and white papers that will be emailed out to everybody. But this is the first one that we're doing. So thank you to those of you that have joined us today. So I want to introduce myself first. My name is Jennifer Longcar. Some of you might know me. I've been in this industry for over 13 years. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships. I've been with NetNatives just since last August. Made the move over here because of some of the really cool things that we're doing in terms of research, creative, digital, as well as our Akiro tech platform, which works to bring marketing and enrollment together. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. So I'm going to go ahead and just kick us off here. And this is what we're here to talk about today. So we're going to go through this a little bit. And some of the things I want to focus on is with the number of 18-year-olds that are decreasing in enrollment, and because of the enrollment cliff that we're all familiar with, that's due in 2025. Higher education institutions really need to be prepared with a strategy that works for future student recruitment. So whether you're attending this webinar from a school within New York and you're trying to learn more about your own market, or if you're at a school that's outside of the state and you might recruit students from New York, this data is going to be beneficial to both of you, hopefully. So this report gives you a look at the current and future state of higher education in New York State specifically. So what we're going to do is focus on college enrollment trends, the health of colleges across the state, and different employment opportunities for graduate that will support you so that you know your market and your competition. You can understand the labor market a little bit more and opportunities. We want to set you up with the best strategy to help reach your audiences. So here at NetNatives, if you're not familiar with us, we love data. Our goal is to really help provide access to robust data so that you can inform your recruitment and marketing efforts in a way that's going to help lead you to success. So as we all know, a higher education presentation would not be complete without talking about either the enrollment funnel or the enrollment cliff. In this presentation, we're going to actually focus more on the looming cliff, and we're going to hopefully provide you with some insights around trends in the state of New York. Our hope is really to replicate this report. Like I said, in the future, we're going to look at other states that are seeing some of the strongest demographic declines. And if you notice, if I happen to look over here at all, it's because I am using two different screens. I just want to make sure that everything is tracking right. So if you see me looking over here, that's why. So basically, in short, this report that we're sharing for you, it's really going to set you up for success now and in the future. So to create this report, we've pulled together multiple data sources to build a picture of the state of higher education in New York. This really includes primary insight into the student mindset and behavior from sources that are unique to NetNatives, actually. Some of the sources include NCES enrollment data, National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, U.S. Census population data, U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, knocking on college door reports, Open Doors report, the World Economic Forum, the World Population Review, NetNative's own College Pulse Insights, SimilarWeb, and then also Google AdWords. So let's begin by setting the scene and talking about some of the detailed demographic information for the state of New York. With that, I'm actually going to pass it over to my colleague, Jeremy, who will introduce himself and walk you through the data. You're on mute, Jeremy, just making sure.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name's Jeremy, and I'm a senior strategist here at NetNatives. I've been working in the field of marketing for the past 3 years in sunny London, but my background is actually economics and statistics. So it's actually been great to sort of jump into this sort of data again, getting back to my roots with macroeconomic analysis and looking at labor market forecasts. So without further ado, we'll jump straight into it. What we can see here is a whole bunch of red. So we're looking at the enrollment annual growth from 2020 to 2021. And it's pretty widespread. The pandemic hit us pretty hard, but this trend of decline isn't actually anything new, as is the case for most sort of trends throughout the US. COVID has actually just exaggerated pre-existing trends. It was only really the smaller states of like Arizona, Colorado, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, which had some nice solid fundamentals before the pandemic, that actually managed to sustain positive growth in 2021. So now looking specifically at New York, we can see we were hit pretty hard with a 5.2% drop off, and we weren't safe from this huge decline. And we'll jump into exactly why in the next few slides. So one of the key reasons why we think this, this declining, shrinking trend isn't going to be going anywhere anytime soon is that it's actually not looking so good in terms of this enrollment cliff, as Jen was mentioning, that's coming up in 2025. So New York has actually already peaked for high school graduates in 2019 with around 214,000. And New York is now expected to sort of see a little bit of a bump coming up to 2025, and then just a consistent decline over the next few decades, averaging about just above 1% each year. Cool. So this also is only just going to be compounding that downward trend that we've been seeing over the past decade. Currently, what we're seeing here is looking at enrollment numbers across all institutions within New York on the left. You can see it's been a pretty nice, steady, well, not nice, but steady decline since the start of last decade. And then what we've done here on the right is we've split the enrollment numbers by four-year institutions and community colleges. So we can see that both have been seeing declines, but particularly community colleges have been becoming less and less popular. And Jen will delve further into that in the webinar. Okay. So New York attracts students across the globe, although in-state students within New York is still the primary source of acquisition for New York universities, making up about 70% of first-year undergrads. On the right here, you can sort of see the hotspots for where students are located and where they're coming from. Obviously, the majority is coming in from around New York City. But then what about the opportunities beyond New York? So thousands of students in the Northeast migrate across the big city each year, particularly from Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The fundamentals look a bit more rosy in these surrounding states as well. So, as I was mentioning, New York's peak is now in the rearview mirror. These guys are now sort of expecting to see the number of high school graduates grow up until 2025, and even in DC 2034. And yeah, I think that's all I got on that. So previously we were having a look at sort of the geographical sources of growth for enrollments and completions based on IPEDS data, and now we'll jump into what programs are expected to become popular and which programs have seen recent declines. So we can see here we're looking at four-year institutions and students completing with a bachelor's. We can see by far the most popular subject within New York is business, but the growth hasn't quite been there. It's sort of stayed flat as the key program. Generally speaking, the programs that are seeing growth are to do with STEM and health, which is very much aligned with what we're seeing in the workforce as well. We'll jump into the next slide.
Oh, sure, sorry.
I'm sorry. While we're seeing more so on the decline sort of things, the programs that are becoming less popular are more so to do with arts, humanities, and social sciences. Obviously, with tertiary education becoming more and more expensive, the importance of job security and potential wages after graduation is becoming more and more important for these students. Now, on the graduate level, we're seeing pretty similar trends across the board. However, education is a far bigger player within this market. In terms of growth, though, again, we're seeing the more sort of science-related programs and engineering and STEM sort of and health doing really well. And then again, the sort of more social sciences doing worse off. But however, these sort of programs that are in decline were actually harder to find in the data, and that's because graduate demand is actually on the rise, despite all this downward sort of trends in the education sector within New York. Graduate enrollments are actually on the up. So you can see that the programs that are declining, it's actually nothing too significant. Nice. Okay, so now we'll jump into labor market, which is a really sort of key aspect that we have to sort of understand if we're going to really sort of figure out the outlook of the education sector. Students need to sort of align themselves with an ever-changing labor market more than ever. So what we're looking at here is the Bureau of Labor Statistics forecasts for what occupations are going to be growing in demand over the next 10 years. So we can see in that big green bar at the top there is to do with healthcare support, and that's aligned with what I was just mentioning, with how health-related study and work is really going to be in demand over the next few years. And then again, you can see underneath that business and finance, and then also some IT and data-related occupations are going to be really sort of key sources of growth within New York's labor market. And then looking at on the other side of the scale, those that are going to be sort of seeing a bit of a shrinkage or decline are those occupations that are very much more vulnerable to things like automation and increasing wages. So we're going to see those sort of repetitive kind of occupations, and also, unfortunately, those to do with like art and entertainment are going to become less and less, well, more and more rare within New York. So now we're looking at all the different industries within New York and then comparing that to the national average. So we can see here in that in the top right, that black circle, you can see how important healthcare and social assistance is to the New York labor force. It's far larger than the rest of the industries, and it is also well above the national average. So again, that's sort of echoing the exact same message that we're trying to say that's happening within the education sector. Health is key for New York. Finance and education are also well above the national average. And again, mirroring what I was just mentioning in the previous slides. And then while things like retail, manufacturing, and accommodation aren't quite as big of employers within New York and aren't quite as important relative to other states.
Awesome. Great. Okay. So now we're going to take a look at, and I know this is a lot of data. So, and that we're really just giving you kind of a high level taste of it today. And because if you had to sit through a presentation like this, that was an hour long of us just spewing data at you, you would all probably fall asleep. But so we want to give you, sorry, Jeremy, I'm not, I'm not knocking the data. I love the data. But we're just giving you a high level. So if you're like reading or seeing some of these slides and you're like, oh my gosh, that's great, I kind of wish they would dive into that a little bit more. We can, and it's the data's there and we can do that. But for this particular webinar, we really just kind of want to give you that high level taste of what's going on. So for the next couple slides, I'm going to talk about some of New York's biggest players in the market. And we want to take a look specifically at some of the schools here. It probably comes as no surprise that 8 in the 10 of New York's largest colleges are four-year institutions. However, the Borough of Manhattan Community College and Excelsior Community College are both in the top 10. Each one of these actually enrolling over 20,000 students. So despite retaining a strong market share and high number of students, actually over half of these top players have actually seen declining enrollments in 2020, which, as Jeremy was mentioning before, the overall trend for New York, this is obviously right in lockstep with that and reflecting that overall trend. Also, perhaps not a surprise to most of us, the two community colleges saw some of the highest decreases, which reflects a broader trend in the state. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes, as well as nationally for decreasing enrollments at community colleges. I know I'm preaching to the choir when I'm talking about that. We all are aware of that issue that's happening. 60% of New York's largest colleges, though, are located in New York City, which also reflects the large population there, as well as the pull of the city. Of those that are outside of New York City, Excelsior College is a fully online provider and are seeing big growth there. So we've also seen in 2020 a dip in enrollments at the state level for New York for both public-private institutions as well as community colleges. So while the relative impact of the population changes and COVID and the effect of COVID is really not known yet, one change that we can see is the switch to online and hybrid learning in the sector. This was obviously driven by necessity. We all knew that we needed to make these changes, and the demand for online learning was in growth mode, but obviously then COVID forced these changes upon us and forced us really to pivot and act quickly. With that being said, so basically looking at the sector as a whole, those who didn't pivot to online learning were actually the worst off in 2020. So there are a few exceptions to the rule. However, when we look at the analysis of college type, it shows us that public schools were generally better at pivoting to online learning and really saw only a marginal drop compared to a lot of the private institutions. This is an area of analysis that we're going to be keeping a close eye on in the next few years to really enable us to share stronger understanding of the true growth patterns. And as we look at the individual institution growth in 2020, we really can't say for sure whether it was driven by an increase in demand for brand or if it's related to the availability of online or hybrid learning. So time is really going to tell about that particular trend. And we should know probably more in the next year or so, really where things are going and why they're going in certain directions. I think that we're all still kind of reeling from COVID and trying to catch up. There's a lot of catch up we're doing and so many things happening at once. So we're definitely going to be taking a look at that and watching that over time. So now let me go through this. If we actually exclude the private institutions in New York, as well as the community colleges, we can then see the four-year public schools who have seen the strongest growth. Leading the way here is SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University. So although they're not as big as some of the other public institutions, their percentage of growth was significantly higher at 12%. So over 60% of their students are online, but it also, this particular type of school, specialty school, aligns with that rising trend of students choosing to go into the health sciences sector, which Jeremy was talking about earlier. So overall in this category, which does make up a smaller number of institutions than the private sector, most growth has been at the larger as well as the mid-size universities. So, however, you can see in here that there's actually a few smaller, more specialized schools, and the keyword is specialized schools in there as well. One thing that I do want to note is that the University of Buffalo is actually featured in both of the top players in New York and the top growth in public universities. So as before, New York City also dominates the growth in this particular category for public institutions. No surprise. So now let's take a look at the private institutions in New York. As for overall size, New York City, again, is the heavy hitter for the strongest growth amongst private four-year non-specialist institutions. So I just want to make sure that I'm specific about that. Private four-year non-specialist institutions, with 5 of the 10 of these schools are actually located in the city. However, when we look at the private institutions, it's not the big universities that have actually seen the growth. In fact, all of these 10 private schools within the largest that have the largest enrollments have seen a decline, and we only seen a couple of institutions with enrollments over 10,000 seeing just slight growth. So the strongest growth overall in the private sector has come from mid to small institutions. So now we're just going to shift a moment away from that traditional market, public and private four-year institutions, take a look at the changing landscape of community colleges in the state of New York. Just a little bit of a slow switch. There we go. Sadly, this is no surprise to anybody. The picture in New York is very much similar to that of the national trend that we're seeing at community colleges, and that's an overall decline in enrollments. We know in New York that New York community colleges are more reliant on local and in-state and in-county enrollment, with about 96% of their enrolled students coming from within the state of New York. So this means that the national enrollment cliff, and particularly New York State's demographic decline in 2025, will have a disproportionate impact on the community colleges. So there's already been an 18% decline between 2016 and 2020, which is not far off from the national average of 20%. So this is another one of those areas where we're going to be really watching it closely as it is released, the data is released, to see if things start to somewhat rebound after COVID. I think it goes along with the trend that we're seeing where many students are deciding to go right into the workforce. We've seen a discussion around the value of higher education, and is it worth spending the money? And so these are all types of topics and trends that we're going to keep an eye on as the data is released. So I want to switch over a little bit to some of the program growth and specifically at community colleges, basically in 2015 versus all the way to 2020. So really only 3 large subjects have actually seen growth over the 5-year period, with a general downward trend for the remainder of the larger subject areas. So this basically reflects the overall decline in the enrollments at community colleges that we've been seeing across the board. As the previous slide said, these point to areas for investment and development of different programs. In particular, as Jeremy mentioned before, computer science and visual and performing arts, which is a large subject areas that have actually seen growth in both the short and long term. As with the 4-year institutions, computer science also leads the growth at community colleges. So as we looked at growth, we're also going to look at the decline here. So fewer enrollments at the community colleges obviously had a big impact on the number of people graduating with liberal arts, humanities, and general studies degrees. This also actually had the biggest, this is the biggest subject area at the 4-year universities that's been hit the hardest as well. So only 3 large subjects have actually seen growth over the 5-year period, as I mentioned, with the general downward trend. This basically, again, is in line with the reflection. As per the previous slide, this points to areas for investment and development in terms of programs, computer science, visual performing arts, as we've seen, the biggest decrease is in liberal arts and humanities. I don't think this is a surprise for anybody, because I know clients that I've spoken to, schools that I've spoken to, have really started to invest more in the liberal arts, studies, humanities to try to boost that, because it has been such a declining area and we've seen such an increase in the specialty areas. So now we're going to shift a little bit. I'm actually going to pass it over to Jeremy again. We're actually going to take a little bit of a shift, and we're going to look at the demographics and the insights of the students in New York using some of our own College Pulse data. So we are able to reach out and poll students. We're able to talk to students, kind of find out what motivates them, find out information about them. And so Jeremy's going to walk through some of the differentiators about the demographics that are actually in the state of New York.
Thanks, Jen. So we run this survey across the country. We survey about 1,000 students each quarter. asking them mainly around the motivations of their study, their digital tendencies, and just what's important to them, really. It's a treasure trove of data that we allowed direct access to our clients. But I'm going to give you guys a sort of like a quick little sneak peek or like a little bit of an overview, just so you get a flavor of the kind of data that's available. So here we're having a look and we can see the ethnicity breakdown for New York. We can see that New York is actually more ethnically diverse than the rest of the country, which I'm assuming is no surprise. And next slide.
There's a little bit of a lag on my side, sorry.
That's all good. And then here we have the socioeconomic status breakdown of New York, comparing this to the rest of the country. New York students are typically more upper class and middle class. And then looking at the political breakdown, we can see that they are very much more Democrat leaning, and that's definitely the case relative to the rest of the country, and especially towards independent as well. Okay, so looking at it, another reason why we're pretty convinced that the undergrad market is going to sort of stay in decline, but then the graduate market will actually pick up to where pre-pandemic levels is. We were surveying these students, and the majority of them have sort of indicated that 2/3 of them are interested in pursuing graduate studies. And then it also seems like as though next slide.
All right.
That's so good. Well, it also seems like as though the pandemic hasn't shifted their eagerness as well, with around.
Oh, sorry, Jeremy, did it flip too fast?
No, I think we've gone back a few now.
I don't know what's going on.
That's so good. The next one? Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, sorry, there's a lag, and so when you say click, I'm thinking I'm clicking, but it's not. It must be my connection on my end. So I apologize. Technical issues.
I'll forgive you this time.
Thanks.
So yeah, so as I was saying, it seems like as though the pandemic hasn't shifted any sort of intent of these students to keep studying, to pursuing postgrad after finishing up with their bachelor's. With about 80% of students still saying that they've got the exact same plans to enroll in, to potentially enroll in graduate studies following on from their undergrad, with some saying that they only about 10% or so saying that they may change programs or change schools as to what their original plan was. But as the vast majority are saying, they're still quite eager to get into the graduate space. So as it will be no surprise to anyone here, the top reason for students wanting to get into graduate study is to increase their earning potential, and to sort of diversify their knowledge and broaden out their career opportunity. Yeah, when you can see that here with this bar graph, with things like challenging themselves or the social life, or because their friends is way down for graduate studies. So we can also sort of track how trends, not just looking at how they are at a certain period of time, but also how they shift. So what we're looking at here is how New York's political lining has sort of recently, at the start of this year, shifted away from Democrat. So we saw in August there was about 50% were indicating that they were Democratic leaning, and within 3 months, we went from 5 in 10 New York students to 4 in 10 New York students were saying that they're Democrat, and seeing quite a big bump in either, a bit of a bump in Republic or Independent. We can also have a look at what media they're finding as they're typically using. So we can see at the top of the charts, Instagram and Snapchat are still quite popular, with around 2/3 using it on a daily basis. We can see that also Facebook has lost favor, with TikTok is very much on the rise. And interestingly, though, YouTube actually has the best coverage across students, but doesn't have quite the daily logins as Instagram and Snapchat does.
Okay, that being said, that's a great little segue into the marketing piece. And we're going to talk about some of the trends specifically that we have seen in New York. So, as well as the national average. So when we look at the average PPC or paid search for November 2021 for all institutions in New York State, it was 28,920 in November, and then about roughly 28,635 in December of 2021. This is higher than the national average, which really stands roughly at about 21 for November and about 18,000-ish for 2021 respectively. So this basically helps to highlight, what do these numbers mean? Helps to highlight the competitive nature of recruitment in New York and the need to ensure that you have sufficient budget to reach your audiences. So I understand that budget is also dependent on institution type as well. But search is the most important marketing channel, as we know, to drive traffic to your websites, which means that ensuring also, if they're coming to your site, that you have really good search engine optimization, that's crucial. Included in SEO, which people don't realize a lot of time, just touching on that, is actually user experience as well. So if students are being driven to your site through search, they have a bad or confusing experience on your site, they are more or less likely to return to your site. So SEO is a huge part of where we are seeing schools now lean and invest their money. Equally as important is ensuring that you have strong brand awareness and demand. So if branding and awareness, I like to think of it like this. Branding and awareness is the pitcher, search is the catcher for your marketing. Without these strategies really working together, you're not going to generate a high level of new traffic from search. So making sure that you have a strong investment in paid advertising is key to ensure your brand reaches your audiences. And as we can see, once I mentioned, a very competitive market in a state like New York. So let's kind of break it down a little bit more and look at the average paid search spend. Paid search spend at four-year institutions, private schools versus public schools. So if we put the previous New York figures into context that I just covered, we can see that it's the private four-year institutions that are actually outspending the publics. They have the highest budgets and are investing more in their paid search advertising. The average spend for November of 2021 was $37,522, and for December, it was roughly $38,960. So if you contrast this to the public four-year institutions whose average spend for November and December respectively were about $2,600 and about $1,900. So I think a lot of times too, when people are thinking about budget spend and budget allocation, sometimes people go, that school is a big public institution and they have so many students, their budget is probably 10 times what my budget is. I'm at the small school, and that's not always the case. So what we've seen in the state of New York in particular is that private schools are outspending the public schools by a lot, significantly. One thing that Jeremy did talk about previously was that social media usage and of New York students in particular. This is what we're seeing. So social channels, you can see they collectively drive around 8 million visits to college websites in New York, in the state of New York per quarter. 8 million visits to college, let me just say that again, 8 million college visits in New York per quarter. Social channels are driving that traffic. That to me, that number was mind-boggling. That's huge. But what we can see here, the most important site and the site that's driving the greatest number of visits is YouTube, followed by Reddit, Facebook, and Twitter. We definitely see a difference here between public and private institutions, their reliance on YouTube. So you can see that the private institutions are much heavier players in the YouTube space, as well as having a greater array of channels that are driving large numbers of visits to private institution sites. So what does this mean, basically? Making sure that you investigate the different available channels and lean towards video. I remember presenting a few years ago and talking to clients a few years ago back and telling them that YouTube was growing and growing, and that was the direction that things were going, and people still really didn't listen and we still find the number of schools who are heavily investing in good video content is much smaller than it should be. It's important to get your brand in front of prospects where they're active. This is showing you where they're active. When you're picking an agency, I think when you're determining who you're going to work with, whoever it is that you are working with, it's important to work with someone who understands higher ed, but also knows the channels where the students are spending their time. And then making sure they know the best way to engage with your audiences to make you stand out, and that they have strong relationships with the different platforms to ensure that you can leverage the newest and most effective ad formats and targeting opportunities that are out there. So what does this all mean? What can you do with some of this information? What am I gonna leave you with in these next couple slides? I think that when we look at these things, some things stand out to me. As we learn to navigate this new normal in higher ed, and the pressure of the demographic shifts that are coming our way, it's more important than ever to really, really understand your competitors. I think that is a big thing. So whether you're recruiting, in the state of New York and you're competing with schools there, or you're actually trying to recruit students from the state of New York and you're competing with schools there. Many of our clients, for example, use our Akiro Data Labs competitor analysis to get a greater understanding of the schools that they're overlapping with. Or if you're working with a partner, consider, or not working with a partner yet, but consider working with a partner to really do a deep dive analysis into your competitor set and potential programs to get a better idea of how you stack up in the market. For example, something like a program viability study combined with a competitor analysis will give you insight into how to position a specific program against competitor programs in a very crowded market. Ultimately, this gives the program the best chance to recruit successfully, both on a micro and a macro level. This brings me to creative and content. So in this crowded market, it is more important than ever to really, really create your own voice and cut through the noise with the authentic and bold creative and content. So this doesn't mean that you need to invest in a full rebrand, but consider a creative and content audit of your marketing materials. Doing a study like that can really help you discover opportunities where you can enhance your campaign creative and content through different analysis and an outside view, an outsider's inspiration. And sometimes it takes that for somebody like on the outside looking in to take a look at that. And how can you break through that noise? Also, one of the things that you can consider doing is something like a brand tracking study. It can give you a baseline so you know where you're starting with your brand recognition and really track the impact that your marketing is actually having on your overall brand. So really, when you're looking to compete in a market like this, where there is a decline in demographics, as well as, it's like a perfect storm, as well as that very heavy competition, this can really help you figure out your ROI and really determine future marketing activity and what you're going to be doing. Something like this, we have something called audience opportunity analysis. So this is kind of a sample of what you can do to dive deeper into your audience. This combines student demographic data from your enrollment CRM with external data sets, like some of those that we actually use today and talked about, and some of the data that we pulled from for this particular webinar. It examines the data sets to help you identify different opportunities where to target new and existing audiences. So by digging in and really unlocking the insight contained within your student records, it's going to help you become more data-driven in your campaign targeting. And one thing that I always like to say is, please don't make any decisions without having good data to back it up. Make sure that when you're doing marketing, you are making data-driven choices with your marketing, because otherwise, you're really doing I hate to say it, but the spray and pray, or just throwing spaghetti up against the wall and hoping that it sticks. So really, first, you want to understand the geographic origins of your student body. So where are they coming from? Overlay this with sector data so that you can really highlight opportunities for growth that are out there. And then you want to also take a look at your audience journey through the recruitment funnel. So doing things like student journey mapping, taking a look at where your choke points are and where your your bottlenecks can be improved, that also is going to help you. Then also comparing your institution against your competitors, as I mentioned before, by doing some studies will help you understand that, and then developing funnel stage demographic profiles of your audience. So you really then get to hone in on who your students are so that you can really tailor your advertising content and your messaging around those particular students. So as I said before, this is really just kind of a little snippet and a really high level overview of what we're looking at in this particular state of New York, and what the rest of the demographic trends are looking like with this, enrollment cliff looming. So really appreciate you all taking the time today to attend this short, nice, sweet little webinar. Hopefully that you got some good data out of this. Some of it you may already be familiar with, some of it might have been completely new to you, but really wherever your your level of knowledge sits, it's really, as I stressed before, more important to understand the different markets and make a plan that's going to set you up for success. So the times are changing. We know that. We've all been working really hard, I think, over the last years to stay ahead of the curve. And I don't want to sound cliche again, but in this day and age now, it's really time to work smarter and not harder to stay one step ahead of your competition. So as I mentioned, stay tuned as we start to dissect and dive into data in some of the other states where we're really seeing some of the biggest demographic shifts. And if you enjoyed this webinar and are interested in learning more about the different kinds of data that we have access to, or any custom research projects you might be interested in, please don't hesitate to contact us directly. We are happy to help you and definitely want to see you succeed. So I want to thank you again, and I hope everybody has an awesome weekend.